A heart-wrenching story of love, betrayal, and redemption that will leave you speechless. When billionaire Jonathan Sterling publicly humiliated his wife Victoria at their anniversary party, declaring he couldn't stand being in the same room with her, he thought he'd won. But when he discovered what she left behind in that wooden box, his entire world shattered in ways he never imagined. Greetings, fellow dreamers. This tale is filled with love, secrets, and a twist you'll never forget. Step into the tale. Crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the marble floor of the Sterling mansion as Victoria smoothed her emerald silk dress one final time. Tonight marked their 5th wedding anniversary. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that Jonathan might remember the woman who had once made him laugh until his sides ached. The pregnancy test hidden in her purse seemed to burn against her fingers every time she reached for her champagne flute. 8 weeks of carrying their miracle. And she hadn't found a single moment when her husband's attention wasn't consumed by merger documents or conference calls with Tokyo. Victoria watched from across their grand ballroom as Jonathan commanded the attention of Manhattan's elite. His deep voice carried across the room, discussing quarterly profits with the same passion he'd once reserved for whispering sweet promises in her ear during their honeymoon in Tuscany. "You look radiant tonight, darling," cooed Margaret Ashworth, wife of Jonathan's biggest competitor. Her smile held the sharp edge of someone fishing for gossip. "Marriage certainly agrees with you." Victoria forced her practiced smile, the one she'd perfected during countless charity galas and business dinners. "Thank you, Margaret. You're very kind." "And when might we expect to hear the pitter-patter of little feet in the Sterling household?" Margaret's eyes glittered with predatory curiosity. Jonathan would make such a wonderful father. Before Victoria could respond, Jonathan's laughter cut through the ambient chatter like broken glass. She turned to see him surrounded by his usual circle of associates, his green eyes bright with the kind of enthusiasm he used to save for their quiet Sunday mornings together. "Children," boomed Richard Caldwell, Jonathan's business partner, loud enough for half the party to hear. "When are you and Victoria going to give us some little Sterlings to spoil?" The question hung in the perfumed air like smoke. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as every conversation around them seemed to pause. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the perfect opportunity for Jonathan to look at her with love in his eyes, to let her share their beautiful secret with the world. Instead, Jonathan's expression twisted with something that looked like disgust. "Children," he said, taking a long sip of his whiskey, his voice carrying that particular tone he used when discussing failed investments. "Have you seen Victoria?" "Lately, Richard. She can barely manage being a wife, let alone a mother." The words hit Victoria like physical blows, each one landing with surgical precision on her heart. Jonathan glanced around the circle, ensuring he had their complete attention before delivering the killing blow. "Honestly, I can't even stand being in the same room with her anymore. She's become this pathetic, clingy creature that follows me around like a lost puppy." The laughter that followed felt like acid in Victoria's veins. Her champagne flute slipped from numb fingers, exploding against the Italian marble in a shower of crystal and golden wine. The sound cut through the party chatter like a gunshot. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward her, including Jonathan's. One breathtaking moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, recognition, perhaps even guilt. But it vanished so quickly she might have imagined it. "Careful there," he said, with the same tone he might use for a clumsy server. "Someone clean that up." Victoria stood frozen in the center of their anniversary celebration, surrounded by the wreckage of her shattered glass and her even more shattered heart. The baby, their precious baby, seemed to flutter in her womb like a butterfly trapped in a hurricane. Her best friend Grace Mitchell appeared at her elbow, her face flushed with righteous fury. "Victoria, honey, let's get you some air." "No," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible above the resumed party chatter. "I need to go upstairs."
Ass!
As she walked toward the elevator, Victoria pressed her hand protectively over her belly and made a decision that would change everything. Jonathan Sterling thought he could destroy her in front of their friends and suffer no consequences. He was about to learn how wrong he was. The elevator ride to their penthouse bedroom felt like ascending to her own execution. Victoria's legs moved on autopilot, carrying her past the photographs of their wedding day, where Jonathan had gazed at her like she hung the moon. Past the piano where she used to play the song he'd written for her during their courtship. All the evidence of a love story that had somehow transformed into a tragedy. In their master bedroom, Victoria sank onto the edge of their king-sized bed and stared at her reflection in the antique mirror. The woman looking back at her wore a dress that cost more than most people's yearly salary, flawless makeup applied by a professional, and jewelry that could fund a small charity. She looked like the perfect billionaire's wife. She looked absolutely miserable. Victoria pulled the pregnancy test from her purse with trembling hands, staring at the 2 pink lines that represented everything she'd ever dreamed of. A family with the man she'd loved since college, when he was just an ambitious business student who brought her wildflowers picked from the campus quad. She'd imagined this moment 1,000 times. Jonathan's face lighting up with joy, his strong hands spanning her belly, his voice thick with emotion as he whispered promises to their unborn child. Instead, he'd just announced to 50 people that the thought of having children with her disgusted him. From her nightstand drawer, Victoria pulled out her leather journal, the same one where she'd been writing letters to Jonathan that she'd never had the courage to give him. Tonight, she would write one final letter, but this one would be different. This one would be goodbye. Victoria began to write, her tears falling onto the paper like rain on parched earth. She wrote about the man she'd married and the stranger he'd become. She wrote about dreams deferred and love unrequited. Most importantly, she wrote about the child he would never know. "My dearest Jonathan," she wrote, "by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I can't keep loving someone who finds my existence unbearable. Our baby deserves better than a father who sees them as a burden and a mother who's forgotten how to breathe without permission." The party continued downstairs, Jonathan's laughter floating up through the floors like mockery. Victoria closed her journal and began to pack. Not everything, just the essentials she'd need to disappear completely. Her grandmother's pearl necklace, a few photographs from happier times, and the ultrasound picture from her doctor's appointment that morning. From her jewelry box, she pulled out her wedding rings, the stunning engagement ring Jonathan had chosen himself, and the simple gold band they'd exchanged during their vows. The rings felt heavy with broken promises as she placed them in an antique wooden box that had belonged to her mother. Inside the box, she placed her final letter along with the positive pregnancy test and several other mementos from their relationship. Love letters she'd written but never sent, concert tickets from their first date, a pressed flower from their wedding bouquet. Everything that proved their love had once been real. Victoria called for a car using a ride service she'd never used. Before paying with cash, she'd been secretly saving for months. As the city lights blurred past the window, she pressed her hand to her belly and whispered a promise to her unborn child. "I'll love you enough for both of us, baby. I promise you'll never feel invisible in your own life." What Victoria didn't know was that Grace Mitchell had watched her leave from the mansion's security room and had already made a phone call that would change everything. Some secrets are too big to keep. Some friends are willing to betray trust to protect the people they love. By morning, Victoria's disappearance would set in motion a chain of events that would either destroy the Sterling family forever or give them a second chance at the love they'd thrown away. The wooden box sat in the center of Jonathan's bed like a time bomb, waiting to explode his world into pieces. And somewhere in the city, a heartbroken woman clutched her belly and tried to believe that walking away from everything she'd ever known was the right choice for her unborn child. But love, real love, has a way of refusing to stay buried. And Jonathan Sterling was about to learn that some losses cut so deep they transform a man into either a monster or a saint. The question was, which would he choose to become? The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Sterling penthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors where crystal fragments still glittered like scattered diamonds. Jonathan Sterling stood in his study, still wearing his tuxedo from the night before, staring at a crystal tumbler of whiskey that had become his breakfast companion. The Shanghai deal was complete. $500 million richer. 3 new luxury properties secured across Asia. His empire had expanded overnight, yet the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. The house felt different this morning. Too quiet, too empty. Usually by now, Victoria would be in the kitchen, preparing his coffee, exactly how he liked it. Reading the financial papers so she could ask intelligent questions about his business ventures. Even when he barely acknowledged her efforts, she had continued trying to be part of his world. "Victoria?" Jonathan called out, his voice echoing through the empty space. No response. She was probably still upset about last night, sulking in their bedroom over his honest assessment of their marriage. Women took everything so personally. Jonathan climbed the spiral staircase to their bedroom, already planning his next conquest. The Tokyo merger needed his attention, and the Dubai project required immediate focus. Success was an addiction, and he needed his next fix. He pushed open their bedroom door, expecting to find Victoria asleep or perhaps awake and ready to apologize for embarrassing him at the party. Instead, he found a room that felt wrong in ways his mind couldn't immediately process. Her perfume bottles were missing from the vanity. The romance novel she'd been reading was gone from her nightstand. Her side of the massive walk-in closet gaped empty, hangers swaying like accusatory fingers in the morning light. But it was the object sitting in the center of their bed that made his blood turn to ice water. An antique wooden jewelry box sat on the pristine white comforter, like an executioner's block. With trembling fingers that had signed billion-dollar deals without flinching, Jonathan lifted the lid. The first thing he saw were his grandmother's engagement ring and their wedding band, nestled together like sleeping serpents. Beneath them lay a letter in Victoria's elegant handwriting. And beside that, a small white plastic stick with 2 unmistakable pink lines. Jonathan's knees gave out. He collapsed onto the bed, the pregnancy test falling from his numb fingers. As he unfolded the letter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, the words on the page blurred together as his world tilted on its axis. Pregnant 8 weeks, their baby. She was carrying their child, and he had destroyed her in front of their friends, announced to the world that the thought of having children with her disgusted him. "No," he whispered to the empty room. "No, no, no." His phone buzzed against the nightstand. A text from his assistant. "The Tokyo team is waiting for your call. Shall I reschedule?" Jonathan stared at the message, then at the pregnancy test, still lying on the white comforter, then at the letter that felt like a knife twisting in his chest. For the first time in his adult life, business seemed completely meaningless. He called Grace Mitchell. "Where is she?" His voice cracked like a teenager's. "Jonathan." Grace's voice was cold enough to freeze whiskey. "I thought you couldn't stand being in the same room with her." "Grace, please." "I found her letter. I found the test." "Where did she go?" "You found out she's pregnant, and your first instinct is to hunt her down. Maybe she's better off without you. You don't understand." "I didn't know. Never would have. Said those things if I'd known. Shouldn't have said those things regardless." Grace's voice rose to a shout. "She loved you, Jonathan. She loved you so much it was destroying her, watching you turn into this cold stranger who treated her like an inconvenience. I can fix this. Tell me where she is." There was a long silence. When Grace spoke again, her voice was deadly quiet. "She made me promise not to tell you. She's trying to protect that baby from becoming another casualty of your ambition. She's my wife." "No, Jonathan. Made it very clear last night that she's nothing to you. A pathetic, clingy creature, I believe were your exact words." Line went dead. Jonathan sat in the ruins of his bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of a love he'd taken for granted and destroyed through his own cruelty. Somewhere in the city, Victoria was carrying his child and planning a life that didn't include him. For the first time since his father's funeral, Jonathan Sterling began to cry. But tears wouldn't bring her back. And as the most powerful man in New York stared at the pregnancy test in his hands, he realized that all his money, all his connections, all his influence might not be enough to undo the damage he'd done to the only person who had ever truly loved him. The hunt for Victoria Sterling was about to begin, and Jonathan was about to discover that some mistakes have consequences that even billionaires can't buy their way out of. 3 weeks of searching had led Jonathan down every possible avenue, Private investigators, security footage analysis, credit card traces that led nowhere because Victoria had been smart enough to use cash. She had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed her whole. His business empire was crumbling. The Tokyo deal had fallen through when he'd missed 3 consecutive conference calls, lost in a haze of whiskey and self-loathing. His board members whispered about hostile takeovers and emergency meetings. Wall Street sharks circled, sensing blood in the water. Jonathan didn't care about any of it. He stood in the rain outside Grace Mitchell's apartment building at 2 a.m, his $1,000 suit soaked through, his carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. "I know you're screening my calls," he shouted up at her 4th-floor window. "I know you can see me down here. Please, Grace, I'm begging you." The window opened, and Grace's head appeared. Even from 4 stories down, he could see her disgust. "Go home, Jonathan. You're making a fool of yourself. I don't care. I'll stand here all night, all week if I have to. She's carrying my child. Grace, my child. Lower your voice. It's 2 a.m. Tell me where she is." Grace disappeared from the window. 5 minutes later, the building's front door opened. She emerged in a bathrobe and slippers, her face a mask of contempt and something else, something that looked almost like pity. "You want to know where Victoria is?" she asked quietly. "Yes. God, yes. She's in a women's shelter, Jonathan. A shelter for abused women, using a fake name because she's terrified that her own husband will find her." The words hit him like a physical blow. "Abused? I never hit her. I never laid a finger. On her, you didn't have to." Grace's voice was deadly quiet. "You destroyed her spirit piece by piece. You made her feel worthless, invisible, like she was an inconvenience in her own life. You think that's not abuse?" Jonathan stumbled backward, the truth of her words cutting, deeper than any physical wound ever could. "There's something else you need to know," Grace continued, her voice now thick with tears. "Something Victoria made me swear never to tell you." "What?" "This isn't her first pregnancy, Jonathan." The world seemed to tilt sideways. "What are you talking about? 2 years ago?" Oh, she was 8 weeks along then, too. She was so excited planning this elaborate surprise to tell you. She had it all mapped out. The perfect romantic evening. Jonathan's mouth went dry. "Grace, what happened to the baby? You happened?" Grace's voice broke. "You came home that night and announced you were flying to London for 6 months to handle the European expansion. You said you couldn't afford any distractions, that you needed to focus completely on business. Victoria tried to tell you about the pregnancy, but you cut her off.
How?
Said you didn't have time for her dramatics." The memory came flooding back. Victoria, beautiful in that yellow dress he'd bought her, trying to speak as he packed his suitcase. He'd been so focused on the London deal, so consumed with proving himself to the board. "She lost the baby that night," Grace whispered. "Stress, the heartbreak, the feeling that she wasn't important enough for even 5 minutes of your time. She hemorrhaged alone in your bedroom while you were already on a plane to London." Jonathan's legs gave out. He crashed to his knees on the wet pavement, rain mixing with tears as the full weight of what he'd done hit him. "She spent 3 days in the hospital," Grace continued relentlessly. "I was the one who held her hand during the procedure to remove what was left of your first child. I was the one who brought her home to an empty house where you'd left dirty dishes in the sink and your laundry scattered across the bedroom floor. Why didn't she tell me?" The words came out as a broken whisper. "She tried to, when you got back from London. But you were already planning the next deal, the next expansion. You told her you didn't have time for women's problems and asked her to make dinner reservations for your business associates." Jonathan remembered that conversation too. Victoria, pale and thin, trying to talk to him about something important while he scrolled through emails about the Dubai project. "So you see, Jonathan, when Victoria found out she was pregnant again, she wasn't just protecting this baby from your ambition. She was protecting herself from having to bury another child because her husband couldn't spare the time to care about anything that didn't make him money." Grace turned to go back inside, then stopped. "Oh, and Jonathan. That women's shelter where Victoria's hiding? I gave them a detailed report about your emotional abuse. If you try to find her, if you show up there, they'll call the police. She has a restraining order against you as of yesterday morning." As Grace disappeared into her building, Jonathan knelt in the rain, surrounded by the wreckage of 2 lives. and to babies that his ambition had destroyed. The most powerful man in New York had finally discovered the true cost of his success, and it was a price he wasn't sure he could live with. 6 months later, Jonathan Sterling was a different man. Entirely. The merger king, who had once commanded boardrooms with ruthless precision, now spent his days in a cramped legal aid office, representing women like the one he'd once broken. His hair had grown out, streaked with premature gray. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple button-downs and khakis. The Sterling Empire had crumbled under hostile takeovers, but Jonathan had discovered something he'd lost along the way: his soul. He was reviewing case files for domestic abuse victims when Grace Mitchell walked into his office. She had the baby, Grace said without preamble. Jonathan's pen clattered to the desk. Is she okay? Is the baby okay? 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Perfect in every way. Grace's voice softened despite herself. Victoria named her Hope. The name broke something inside Jonathan's chest. Hope. After everything he'd put her through, Victoria had still chosen Hope. I need to see her. She doesn't want to see you, Jonathan. She's built a good life. She works at a children's hospital now, lives in a small apartment with her daughter. She's happy. I've changed, Grace. You have to believe me. Have you? Grace studied his face carefully. Because I have something to tell you that's going to test every bit of that supposed change. Jonathan waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. Victoria is sick, Jonathan. Really sick. The doctors found it during her pregnancy, but she refused treatment that might have hurt the baby. Now the cancer has spread. The world went silent. Jonathan heard nothing but the sound of his own blood rushing through his ears. How long? 6 months, maybe less. She needs experimental treatment, the kind that costs $500,000 and isn't covered by insurance. Jonathan was all ready, reaching for his phone, calculating how much he had left in his personal accounts after the company's collapse. Stop, Grace said firmly. I know what you're thinking, and she won't take your money. She's too proud, and she doesn't trust you. Not to use it as leverage to force your way back into her life. Then what am I supposed to do? Let her die. That's where it gets complicated. Grace pulled out a manila envelope. There's something else. Yes. Something I found out yesterday that Victoria doesn't know yet. She handed him the envelope. Inside were medical records, genetic testing results, and a letter from Victoria's oncologist. The experimental treatment she needs requires a bone marrow transplant from a genetically compatible donor. Victoria doesn't have any living relatives who match. Grace paused, watching Jonathan's face carefully, but Hope does. The baby's bone marrow is a perfect match. Jonathan stared at the papers, understanding immediately. They want to use the baby's bone marrow to save Victoria. It's not dangerous for Hope. She's young. She'd recover completely. But the procedure would need to happen soon, and Victoria would need months of follow-up care. She'd have to let me back into their lives, not just let you back in. She'd have to trust you with both their lives. The treatment would require her to be completely vulnerable, dependent on you for everything while she recovered. Jonathan set the papers down with shaking hands. This was it. The universe offering him a chance at redemption, but only if he could prove he'd truly changed. There's one more thing, Grace said quietly. Victoria doesn't know about the bone marrow match. She's planning to refuse all treatment. She'd rather die than risk being a burden on anyone. She's not a burden. Then prove it. That evening, Jonathan stood outside Victoria's apartment building, holding a single white lily and a letter he'd spent 3 hours writing. He'd called ahead, asked Grace to arrange a meeting, promised he would leave the moment Victoria asked. Him too. When the door opened, Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. Victoria was thin, almost fragile, but her eyes still held that fierce determination that had first drawn him to her in college. In her arms, she held a tiny girl with Victoria's dark hair and Jonathan's green eyes. Hello, Victoria. Hello, Jonathan. Her voice was carefully neutral. Grace said you had something important to discuss. I do. He held out the letter. But first, I need to ask you something. Do you remember that song you used to play on the piano? The one I wrote for you during our courtship. Victoria's careful. Composure cracked slightly. Why are you asking me that? Because I need you to know that I remember too. Remember all of it, Victoria. Every moment I was too blind and too selfish to see what I was destroying. Hope began to fuss in Victoria's arms, and without thinking, Jonathan reached out to stroke the baby's tiny cheek. She quieted immediately, staring up at him with curious green eyes. She's beautiful, he whispered. She's perfect.
Jonathan, what do you want? He handed her the letter, then pulled out the medical records Grace had given him.
I want to save your life. And I want to spend whatever time you'll give me proving that the man who broke your heart is gone forever. Victoria read the letter first, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed his words of regret, his promises, his desperate pleas for forgiveness. Then she opened the medical records and saw Hope's bone marrow compatibility results. Asking me to let you back into our lives because Hope can save me? I'm asking you to let me back into your lives because I love you both more than my own life. The bone marrow match just means I might actually have the chance to prove it. Victoria looked down at Hope, then back at Jonathan. If I agree to this treatment, if I let you help us, there's no guarantee I'll survive. You could end up raising Hope alone. Then I'll love her enough for both of us. I'll make sure she knows every day how much her mother sacrificed to give her life. And if I do survive, if we get through this together, Jonathan knelt down in front of her, his eyes never leaving hers. Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel invisible again. I'll choose you every day, Victoria. And Hope above everything else. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying his face, searching for any trace of the cold, ambitious man who had broken her heart twice. The man I married would have seen this as a business transaction. Way to get what he wanted. The man you married was a fool who nearly lost the only things that mattered. I'm not him anymore. Hope reached up and grasped Jonathan's finger in her tiny fist. And Victoria saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. Love. Real, selfless, overwhelming love. "'Kay," she whispered. "Let's save my life." "Da." As Jonathan gathered Victoria and Hope into his arms for the first time in nearly a year. He felt something he'd never experienced in all his years of building his empire. He felt complete. The road ahead would be difficult. Months of treatment, uncertainty, and the delicate work of rebuilding trust that had been shattered beyond repair. But as they stood together in the doorway, a family reunited by the very thing that had once torn them apart, Jonathan knew he had finally found something worth more than all the money in the world. Love that had refused to stay buried. Hope that had been reborn from ashes. A second chance that some people never get. 1 year later, Victoria Sterling walked down the aisle of the small church where she and Jonathan had been married 8 years before, but this time she carried Hope in her arms, and Jonathan's eyes held nothing but love and gratitude as he watched his wife and daughter come toward him. This time, when they exchanged vows, they both understood the true meaning of the words "in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, till death do us part." This time love had won. The end.